That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Welcome back to everyone. Good to see you again, Ben. Welcome back to our listeners. Welcome back to our viewers. And first thing I think we should start with is an apology. We had a fantastic episode last week with Bernie Spoforth, but we should apologise for the fact we haven't been able to get an episode in every week. It's been absolutely crazy at the Free Speech Union. Ironically, of course, there's been a heck of a lot to talk about that we would have loved to have talked about. But unfortunately, I think we've probably had cases and queries coming into the team at the Free Speech Union at least 2 or 3 times the normal rate pre the election, which I don't think is any surprise to people who are listening to this or to people who are watching this. You're well aware of the number of new members we've had, and also the number of free speech issues that we've had. And I thought we could actually start on that, Ben, with thinking about where we are with 100 days of this new government. I mean, I think it's going well, isn't it? I don't think there's anything to worry about with free speech since the 4th of July. Nothing to see here. Jog on. My point being, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, I was starting to make a list of how this first 100 days have gone. I decided I wouldn't touch on the fact that millionaires are fleeing and other things are happening because I was going to get political before I knew it. But just from a free speech perspective, there is quite the list. The big elephant in the room, obviously, is the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which was struck out with a simple movement of the pen of Bridget Phillipson at the end of July. And it really started just to go further downhill after that. We had the self-censoring that's clearly now going on after that with the riots and the fallout from the riots and the fact that people were getting into terrible trouble for what they were putting on Facebook. And a lot of people signed up after that. Well, not just Facebook, on Twitter and on social media generally. And if you haven't listened to that Bernie Spoforth podcast from last week, do go back to it. Do have a listen, because it really brings home what can happen quite easily and quite suddenly from the use of social media in these times. Something also that struck me over the weekend is that, or rather over the last week or so, is that something that was pledged in the New Labour manifesto, sorry, not the New Labour manifesto, in the Labour manifesto from the election on the 4th of July, is a new unit called the Office for Equality and Opportunity. And it sounds very benign, it sounds very vanilla, but actually it looks like that unit is seeking to make good on the manifesto pledge for a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. And as many of our listeners will already know, the problem with that is that it is a free speech issue, because it will effectively criminalize doctors and therapists and counselors who just want to talk to young people looking to transition and to say, well, have you thought about this deeply enough? Are you ready for medical treatment? Is there something else going on? There's often a perspective. There's often a bigger picture. And so I think that criminalizing that, or even threatening to criminalize those sorts of conversations, is going to have even more a chilling effect on free speech. That's just the beginning of my list of the first 100 days of this new government, Ben. But you've probably got other things that occur to you.
Well, I do. While you were speaking, Tom, I mean, first of all, as you've said, apologies that we've not been in touch and putting these episodes out as often as we would have liked. We have been inundated on every possible front, and I'm sure listeners and viewers would want us to be putting our time and energy first and foremost into helping people who are facing cancellation, into fighting these political battles. The other point I'd add to your list, Tom, is the resurrection of non-crime hate incidents, particularly with in connection with the incredibly ill-defined term Islamophobia. And also at the end of last week and over the weekend, this was being reported. The third-party harassment in the new workers' rights legislation that the government has announced. And there was a quote from Toby in the Telegraph about this, in an article explaining how this requirement on employers, telling employers that they must protect their employees from harassment on the basis of a protected characteristic from customers or third parties. This would create a situation in which pubs, for example, pub landlords would be expected to become sort of banter police, where there would be codes of conduct so that employers could show that they had taken steps to protect their employees from third-party harassment. So to take another example of universities, it might well be that a trans activist could say that the presence of Kathleen Stock or another gender-critical academic or author giving a talk on campus is harassment, that I'm being harassed by a third party in my university. And so in all sorts of ways, in all possible contexts, that is something that is going to introduce the sorts of language guides, Tom, that we've spoken about so many times in previous episodes, and stifling codes of conduct. It's a huge attack on any sort of levity or fun or sense of humor. It introduces the possibility of private conversations in pubs if they're overheard by a member of staff, if you're talking about political issues in a way that they find to be discriminatory or to harass them in some way on the basis of their protected characteristic. It then becomes a liability for the proprietor. And so I suppose what we're saying really, and it's not an optimistic message, is we've had the first 100 days. The second 100 days are not looking particularly rosy as far as free speech is concerned. And we do have all of these battles still ahead of us. And as we've said, that has meant that we're not putting out these episodes on the weekly basis that we had been before. But we are trying in every possible theatre to stop things getting worse.
It feels like the fight for free speech has gone mainstream. We've started off as a very niche, or as the Americans would say, niche organization back in February 2020. We've gained credibility. We've won some battles. We've won some very significant battles. Obviously the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act is one of our flagship wins, as was before the election. But with this long shopping list of rowing back on good changes to legislation that we've achieved over the last 4.5 years, the rowing back on that really gives us that sense of the fight for free speech is now mainstream. And that's a positive thing if that means that people more broadly are waking up to these issues and these battles and these drip, drip, drip erosions, because it's quite clear it's not drip, drip, drip erosion now of our freedoms. It's not even a trickle or a stream. It feels like it's a torrent, and therefore we can get together and marshal our forces to fight for free expression in the United Kingdom.
One thing, I think you're right, Tom. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. And one of the anecdotal ways in which I've measured that is that when you're, you meet somebody who's speaking for the first time and you're asking, what do you do? Obviously, explaining our jobs, it's quite unusual. It's not like you can just say, "Oh, I'm a teacher," or
I'm a data man.
Or
Ben, it's very easy. I do data. I sit in the corner and I get ignored and have vegetables thrown at me by everyone else.
but explaining that your day job is to save people from being cancelled on the basis of their beliefs, their political views, or whatever. Obviously that's a conversation that is not a kind of open and shut thing. People always have follow-up questions about it, and you can tell quite quickly sometimes people are hostile to the idea of it, or they imagine that you and I, Tom, spend most of our time defending people who've said I don't know, incredibly racist things or
We're
sort of deeply
swivel-eyed
unpalatable.
loons, aren't we, Ben?
Yeah, exactly. So that you can sometimes detect that sort of reaction, but I think increasingly over the last 3.5 years that I've been doing this for, and perhaps particularly since the election, um, people are really engaged by it
Yeah.
and interested in it, and I think most people were before, to be fair, but those kind of slightly wary reactions that you sometimes get, I don't seem to have that anymore.
Yeah, no, I still
I
get it,
think
but
it has
that's for
gone
different
into
reasons. But yeah,
don't dwell
I
on it too
think
much.
that's a very, very important point, actually, Ben. We've gone mainstream as well, as it were. Should we move on to our first main topic of
Let's.
today, which I think none of our listeners and none of our viewers will be surprised at? It is this very hot off the press news that Suella Braverman was going to speak in Cambridge last Thursday, the 10th of October. She was going to talk about her career and her life in politics. She was speaking to the Cambridge University Conservative Association, or CUCA, which she actually led 20 years ago as a student. So she's obviously very young, because that's a long time after I left Cambridge and I popped into CUCA once. I think we had Sir Geoffrey Archer speaking to us at that point. So she's very young to have been president that recently. So she went back to talk about how things, her own career and her life in politics, which is obviously pretty interesting for people to listen to. But she was forced to call off the speech. Why? Because pro-Palestinian protesters effectively used mob rule tactics to the point that she was advised by the police not to have the event go ahead. Plus, the university said the security would cost £1,500. It always seems to be £1,500, Ben. I don't know why it's £1,500,
Yes,
but it seems to be a number that comes back.
Yeah, we've written a few checks for £1,500
Yeah.
to cover the cost of bouncers and a new venue or whatever. Yes, that seems to be the market rate.
It's not so. I mean, effectively, this event was cancelled as a result of that, and this is the perfect example of the pocket veto that would not have been allowed had the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act been enacted on the 1st of August, as it would have been if our previous Prime Minister had not called the election when he did. It would have been safely put into force, enacted, and Suella Braverman would have been able to go along and to have challenged the university under that act to ensure that there was sufficient security, and they couldn't have been given the bill for that. It would have been needed to have been shouldered by the university authorities. And it would have been a much simpler process to complain about free speech being squashed on campus. So this is a textbook case with a former cabinet minister where we are now seeing the consequences of what Bridget Phillipson did at the end of July in stopping that piece of legislation from going through. And at the Free Speech Union, Toby has reached out to Suella Braverman and to CUCA and has offered to pay the security cost to allow the event to go ahead at a later date. So I believe that those negotiations are ongoing as we speak. And that may or may not happen, but it's a classic case again because it was our flagship piece of legislation, not our piece of legislation, but it was a big success for the Free Speech Union. It's something we feel is very close to our heart, and when a former Home Secretary is now deplatformed in a flagship university. I mean, people who went to Oxford may disagree with me there, but I think a fair number of people think Cambridge is a pretty good institution, a flagship institution, a former Home Secretary, a textbook case of the pocket veto. It's obvious that we should do all that we can to make sure this talk goes ahead.
A few points. If you're listening to this and you're ever in a similar situation and you're a student or you're organising an event at a university, and you deal with this you face this sort of pocket veto where the university is saying, oh yes, of course, in principle, this event can go ahead and we're completely committed to freedom of speech, academic freedom, all that good stuff. But you find that they then say, well, of course, you've got to pay for security. And of course, you've got to pay for this particular venue, not that room. And of course, you've got to meet all of these other requirements. And of course, you're personally liable for whatever happens at this event. it would take a courageous individual, I think, to go ahead and say, yes, fine, all right. Do approach us for help, is what I'm saying. And as we were saying a moment ago, Tom, we have paid for security and venue costs. I mean, the ideal situation would be that universities know that they can't get away with that, using the security costs argument as a way to scupper events. But we are where we are. The other point I wanted to make, Tom, was that I wonder if, in addition to removing duties or preventing the enactment of enforcement of duties that obviously would have been tremendously useful, the government has also, by blocking the act from coming into effect, sent a signal to woke activists of various kinds that it's open season, that actually the government is not going to be cracking down on universities to protect freedom of speech, even under existing law. And although there have been statements from ministers, I think Jackie Smith last week in the House of Lords saying, "Oh yes, of course we care about freedom of speech, etc., etc." The signal that gets through is not that. Yeah. The signal that gets through is government scraps Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. That's the signal that people hear.
Yeah, absolutely. The mood music matters. So yes, the letter of the law obviously matters, and in the specific case, it absolutely matters. But more broadly, the mood music matters, and it does change the way people are dancing, as it were, to the free speech issues. I'm gonna stop this metaphor before it sort of it unravels and goes out of control. Dancing music, but what I thought this morning was very interesting is that the paper of record, the Times, I think it is still the paper of record, the Times has a piece on its own view. So the Times' own view, a small article about free thinking and on challenging students. And there are a few sort of snippets that I saw coming out of that article that really resonated with what you've just said, Ben. The first being that bullying behavior, if left unchecked, achieves its oppressive effect, which is what you're saying. It needs to be checked, and it needs to be seen to be checked, or else the oppressiveness continues. Also, that widespread dysfunction calls for a general rather than a piecemeal remedy. And the last quote from that article is that the government should listen, learn, and compel universities to comply with their legal duties. Because, of course, many of the duties in the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act were already in place. They just weren't brought together in a way that really made it crystal clear what would happen if these duties were not upheld. In other words, the complaint system, and also the new role in the Office for Students in terms of what we call the free speech czar. So I think that it's very interesting that the paper record, and I only say that because it kind of adds a little bit more impetus to that opinion piece, is saying that they are concerned as a paper about this mood music and what that will do for students in universities. And we're seeing it. We are already seeing it. We're 3 months later, and it's already having this effect.
Yeah. And as I said, this is, of course, without the added factor of the new Workers' Protection Bill and the spectre of third-party harassment and the ways in which that would cut across the free speech duties that universities have.
So even if you go to the bar and say the wrong thing at the bar, you suddenly got a whole new set of free speech issues.
And if you can't say the wrong thing in a university bar, Tom, I mean, where on earth can you?
We really are scuppered. Yeah, we really are. Our next item is, I guess it's going to be quite close to your heart because you probably read this when you were studying. You probably got it behind you on the bookshelf.
Just before you introduce this item, Tom, can I say I had not seen this in the news, and the first time I saw this item was when I opened up our show notes that Tom had prepared over the weekend, and I could not actually believe that this was true.
Have you not been paying attention, Ben, to what's been going on over the last 4 years?
I literally could not believe the direct quote that I think you're about to give us. So,
yes,
Tom,
Here we go.
Here we go.
So this is another university, and also it concerns a text. So Nottingham University has slapped a trigger warning on Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales because they contain, quote, one of the reasons is that they contain, quote, expressions of Christian faith. So a notice has been issued to students and it alerts them to incidences of violence, mental illness, and expressions of Christian faith in the works of Chaucer and other medieval writers such as William Langland, John Gower, and Thomas Hoccleve. Am I pronouncing that right, Ben? I'm not a great reader of Thomas Hoccleve. It's double C and medieval, so it's probably something completely different. But anyway, I mean, the very idea that something that contains expressions of Christian. I go back to King Charles. What did he say when he was asked to become king, or he was proclaimed king? He was deemed to be defender of the faith, and held a Bible aloft, and essentially that is how our country is constituted, around the Bible, around the Christian faith. Obviously, this is just sort of the first thing you learn on your mother's knee, and yet expressions of Christian faith now warrant a trigger warning. And I don't know what you think about this, Ben, but I think this is an extension of critical race theory, in effect, saying that Christianity is in essence a racist religion, a European religion, which is not true.
But a white religion.
It's a white religion. It's a European religion. Yeah. It's an oppressive religion, notwithstanding the fact of billions and billions of people who believe in Christ and follow the religion. I mean, it just doesn't stack up for a minute.
One thing I want to say, and this was not my first reaction on seeing this story this morning, but one of the paradoxes of our time is that. So just to take the quote from the university by way of introduction, a university spokesman said, even those who are practicing Christians will find aspects of the late medieval worldview alienating and strange, end quote, and therefore the university decides that it must protect students from this. The paradox of our time is that in the popular imagination, in popular culture, the main way in which people have engaged with the medieval past, I would argue, in the last 10 years, has been through Game of Thrones. It has been through George R.R. Martin's hyper-violent, hyper-sexualized kind of reimagining of the Wars of the Roses in a fantasy setting. And you have that on the one hand, in which violence is routine and absolutely shocking, and I would say actually far more violent than medieval life.
Well, everyone dies, don't they? You just get used to a new character, and they get their head chopped off.
So you've got that on the one hand, and then you've got universities on the other saying, "Oh well, hang on, students can't cope with Chaucer. This is, of course they can't cope." So it's a complete nonsense, because the ways in which people have been engaging with the medieval past, or their sense of it, has been through a television series that would have been completely unimaginable 30 or 40 years ago because of its level of violence and gore and so on. And so I think that reveals the fact, Tom, that you have just adumbrated, that this is actually happening for ideological reasons. It is not actually the case that people can no longer cope with medieval violence or the strangeness of the medieval view. It is the case actually that all of the past now has to be problematized. Everything has to be condemned, and students need to be primed, not because they are going to find these things difficult to comprehend, but they are being instructed that in this brave new world they ought to find them difficult, they ought to find them repellent. That's what's going on.
It's a new taboo. And a few things also occurred to me on this is where's the chaplain of the university, and what does he or she have to say about this? Because most universities have chaplains. Maybe they don't have a chaplain. I don't know. But you'd imagine the chaplain sort of standing up and saying, hang on, that's my faith. That's how I get paid. And you're saying now that the way in which I get paid is so problematized that you're having to warn the students that walk past my window every day about a book they're reading that discusses the faith by which I get paid. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Meanwhile, of course, the Church of England, as we've said many times, of course, is off on its critical race theory days and its anti-racism days, instead of standing up against this and saying, hang on, I am that faith incarnate, in terms of I'm wearing the garb. These are my clothes. This is what I do. This is crazy. So there are so many silly things about this.
Well, I've just gone on to the university website, Tom, to find out about the situation with the chaplain, and there is a multi-faith services manager who has her pronouns. Anyway, not to target.
So things have moved on.
To answer your question,
yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm sure regular listeners, regular viewers will be well aware of how often it's either a speech code that pops up, or it's a new thing, the countryside is racist, or it's a charity that's published something that you're not allowed to say, or in this case, it's a university. Every week it seems to the ante seems to go up. It's up the ante, up the ante, up the ante. Just when you think you've reached the edge of sanity, you're pushed a little further. So hopefully part of the purpose of today is that we all have a bit of a therapy session, actually saying, yes, this is crazy. Yes, this shouldn't be happening. And that's what we're here to do, in case people get in trouble by the craziness coming into play.
Yeah. The other thing is, I mean, there are articles that come out pretty much at the start of every academic year with, and there were some in the last few weeks, with academics saying students nowadays on English literature courses can't actually cope with reading a full novel. They can't read an entire Dickens novel. They can't read A Tale of Two Cities or whatever. And gone are the days in which you could say to university student that you've got to read these 4 novels by Dickens this week. This was in the Times, I think, a few weeks ago. Somebody was making this case again, and I think it goes without saying, really, that there is a decline in people's ability to read. A decline, by the way, that's not just located in the young. I think this is something that is true as the iPad effect.
The Instagram and the Facebook and the Twitter, that's where we're living in the moment, the doom scrolling and all of that. Yes.
Yeah. But so you have that pressure that universities, academics have got to cope with. And then you've got the people who should be encouraging you to seek out and read classic texts, saying to you, actually, don't bother. It's it's pretty repellent. You'll just find it unsettling.
And who suffers? Who suffers? I mean, you are fortunate enough to be a bookworm. I think you've always been a bookworm. You read and read and read and read, and it's absolutely one of the greatest joys in life is to sort of tuck yourself away with a book and get swept away by it. It's a cliche, and there's no way you can say this stuff without sounding like a cliche, but it's true. And you get a much deeper understanding, a much more rooted understanding of all sorts of things. And in particular, the connectivity of knowledge, the way that things really do connect between disciplines. A mathematician does have something in common with a historian, and that is a love of deep knowledge and of the pursuit of a deeper level of knowledge. And the book does that in a way that I don't think has ever been replicated. The book achieves that. It's at your own pace, in your own way, in your own head. Also,
it lets you, particularly with fiction, it enables you to see the world, or a world, through somebody else's perspective completely. And I think the greatest novels that I absolutely love for achieving this effect are Patrick O'Brien's Master and Commander sequence, 21 books. And when you sit and read those, as when you read Jane Austen, you are completely immersed in a long 18th century world. And they transport you to this world entirely. And you think in the way in which his characters think. Now, that is a great reading experience, where you start to perceive the character's world through the character's own perspective and their mental frame, and through their choice of language. And I think that is one of the preconditions to having a democratic society. It's the ability to see where other people are coming from. And I think one of the preconditions for that, as I've just described, actually is reading, and particularly reading fiction, and getting the ability to understand other perspectives. And I think the rise of literature, rise of democracy, obviously these are things that are happening at the same time. I think they're related processes. And I think particularly with cohort that are going through the education system now, missing out on that experience, and I don't fault those young people for it. I think there's been a failure of the grown-ups in the room to provide them with that experience, and young people are responding to the world in which they've grown up. But clearly they're not getting that in the way that they ought to be, or to the extent or with the intensity that they should be. And there's nothing like reading for getting rid of the solipsism of youth and for understanding other perspectives. So all of these problems, I think, are very closely related to each other.
I like the way you threw in the word solipsism. I'm gonna have to go and remind myself. I do. I think, yeah, it is. It is the. Isn't it something to do with the way that youth get obsessed with knowledge and get or
Well, no, it's thinking that only your own perspective exists, and being trapped in your own
yeah.
world, and an inability to understand.
There you go. I've just admitted my complete ignorance. I did look it up once.
Tom is a very clever mathematician. That's what I said.
Well, I can't read.
And a brilliant piano player as well. I went over the weekend.
We should end with the exciting, upbeat news that we have the Battle of Ideas coming up. It's an annual event, a full weekend coming up this Saturday the 19th and Sunday the 20th of October in London. It's organised by the Academy of Ideas. It's their sort of flagship get-together. I've been once. I think, Ben, you've been many times, and every time I go along, I absolutely love it. There's so much happening in parallel. It's impossible to eat all the fantastic dishes that are sort of served up in relation to ideas, debate, all sorts of areas of freedom, including freedom of expression. And I think one of the threads of the weekend always tends to be the freedom of expression thread. But it brings together all sorts of things. You have folks from The Spectator are there, folks from Trigonometry and from Spiked, and some podcasts get recorded there, and it's possible to be in the audience and to ask questions. But what are we doing? We have a stand, and so do come along, and will be possible to sort of spread the word about the Free Speech Union, get more people to sign up to the Free Speech Union. You can also get discounted tickets to the Battle of Ideas. And in particular, on Saturday afternoon, there is a session on academic freedom, which we've talked about in this podcast. And our Chief Legal Counsel, Bryn Harris, will be talking about our fight against the government's attempt to squash the Freedom of Speech Act. And Bryn, he will be joined by Akua Reindorf, KC, who is the UK's leading equality barrister, by Helen Joyce, who will be known to many people. She's been platformed across many, many UK campuses, and she's a journalist turned campaigner, by Michelle Shipworth, who has been, again, will be very familiar to listeners. She's a UCL academic that has sought out our help and has an ongoing case that relates to the chilling influence of the Chinese government on academic life. And then Graham Stringer, MP, a Labour MP, who wrote an article expressing his disappointment at his own party's abandonment of academic freedom. So that's on the Saturday. And if you also are able to make it onto the Sunday, or if you can only make it on the Sunday, there's also Toby Young. He'll be in action on Sunday's panel called "Does the UK Need a First Amendment?" ? What a great question. And what a question that we find ourselves circling around that question pretty much every episode, I think. What would it be like if we had a First Amendment? I think the befuddlement comes up when we realize, well, America does have a First Amendment, but they also have free speech problems. So is it a silver bullet? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's possible to join that panel. It's also possible to be on the audience for GB News show, the show Free Speech Nation. And going back to podcasts, looking at this list here, there's Planet Normal, Spiked, Andrew Gold's Heretics, and the Winston Marshall Show. So it's a cornucopia, isn't it, Ben, of free speech stuff and events that are going on in one weekend.
Yes. And for our part, Tom, we will try and be more consistent or revert to our usual consistency in putting out these episodes. I fear we sound a little bit like teenage boys when packaged off to university promising to call their mum more often. And
Speak for
inevitably it doesn't
yourself.
happen. But we are actually going to try.
Try and keep our
That's
episodes more frequent. But we're back, and it's very good to speak to everyone today. And we wish everyone a fantastic week. So bye for now.
Goodbye.